Good day, everyone. This is Hani of Critical Faculty, and today we're going to be discussing another topic. Today's conversation is going to be around the teleological argument, also known as the argument from design, the watchmaker. It's got many names over the years. And I've got just the right person, good friend of mine, who's got a brilliant philosophical mind that I will always lean on when it comes to difficult conversations like this. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan MS Pearce. Hello, Jonathan. How are you?
Hello, Hanny. Always a pleasure, never a chore. It's so great to be in the presence of something so well designed as yourself. You are like the epitome of natural design, and I honestly, there's no other explanation for your existence other than an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God.
I can tell you for sure I've got flaws, and which means I
Right.
know for a fact I wasn't designed. But you know what? You know that song with all your perfect imperfections. Sometimes imperfections can be perfect.
My God, we already like 5 seconds in, and we covered the argument for design. This is amazing.
This is a very old. William Paley kind of made it popular, but do you think it had elements floating around? I mean, Aristotle, different people over a period of times, and I don't think I can blame them. I think if I lived in an era where the tools of epistemology were kind of almost non-existent. You look at certain things and you go, bloody hell, it looks like it's been designed for me.
Yeah, I mean, some people are saying it goes back to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Romans, Islamic philosophy, all sorts. So there's a rich history of this argument. I guess Thomas Aquinas, in a fifth way, was uh, one of the strongest proponents of the design, or at least laid it out in a way that a lot of people still recognise as being kind of the design argument. And then William Paley came up with the watchmaker's argument. I don't know if we start with an iteration of the watchmaker's argument. Maybe would that be a useful place to start?
Yeah, I think probably we should skip it because we probably recognize by now that people have recognized that there could be some sort of design from early on, but they couldn't really kind of put it in words. And I think William Paley was the first attempt to write, about it and actually put it in a proper philosophical frame.
Yeah, so he said, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that. For anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I'd found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. There must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. And that's what he said in 1802, which is to say that, right, stone doesn't look like it's been designed and we could say it's been there forever. But if I was to find a watch, then that looks designed and therefore there must be a designer. And actually, nature is a perfect analogy. That's kind of the claim here for the watch, or, all the intricacy of nature and how it works and how living organisms are, constructed or designed. There is the analogy with the watch, so therefore there must be a designer, uh, that exists. Therefore, God is a simplification of that. I mean, so you could simplify that into a few syllogisms. Here's a couple. All things have an order or arrangement and work for an end. The order of the universe cannot be explained by chance, but only by design and purpose. Design and purpose is a product of intelligence. Therefore, nature is directed by divine intelligence or great designer. That's kind of Aquinas's thinking. So Thomas Aquinas, a famous Christian philosopher, theologian. Another way, the universe has order, purpose, and regularity. The complexity of the universe shows evidence of design. Such design implies a designer. Therefore, this designer must be God. And that's basically the design argument, or the teleological argument. So teleology deals with purpose, ends, goals, meaning. So that's the idea is the universe is going towards a goal, or it has a purpose, or it looks like it's designed, and therefore God. And we can have a look at the analogies and see whether that works. You could reduce these arguments before you come back. We could reduce these arguments to a simpler reduction, which is there is order, or there is regularity, therefore there must be God. Something must explain like regularity.
Right.
There you go.
We must remember that Paley died in 1805, and Darwin wasn't born until 1809. And his theory of evolution was popularized way later on, a few decades after the departure of Paley. You've got it there.
I'm literally wearing a Darwin shirt here, and it's got a little thing about Darwin at the bottom. It's a monkey made up of lots of monkeys. Anyway, there you go. But you're absolutely right. It's kind of problematic, I guess, for Paley if he didn't have a full understanding of the nature of the universe, really, of how things work, of our best understandings, both physical, cosmological, biological, evolutionary understanding of the world, and that might stunt his imagination, perhaps.
You know what? Because the analogy that he made to start with, he talked about the rock, and then talked about a watch. And he's trying to say, well, the universe is more like the watch, not the rock. And he's got that terribly wrong. It's actually more than it's the rock that is closer to the universe than the watch itself.
Well, I mean, really, I suppose you could say, what's the most complex thing in the known universe? The most complex thing in the known universe is a human brain. So it's like, okay, what explains a human brain? It could be one way of looking at it, because all the things that we've designed and made have come from the human brain, right? And so it could be that's a better place to start than maybe the watch. But and then you can talk about the human brain being as a result of evolution, and then we get back to all of these kind of arguments. I guess one thing to say is this is a posteriori argument. So this is an argument based on induction, based on observation. Right? It's not a deductive argument that says, right, stone cold, like the universe is created by God because you follow these premises and it follows indubitably that God exists, right? This is like, well, it seems like that's the case, and we're looking around and we see design there, and I'm going to infer that takes place over here, and so it's a different type of argument than a deductive argument, for what that's worth.
Yeah, well, he's obviously neglecting another thing. He thinks that every design or every make of some sort must have a maker, and then makes that huge leap that the maker must be aware and conscious as well, and have desires and wants.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of these arguments, you can say the same for the Kalam cosmological argument that argues for the creation of the universe being, everything has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, blah blah blah. Therefore, the universe had a cause for existence. Therefore, God. But then you've got to do an awful lot of work to get from the Kalam up to, like, say, for example, the Christian God or the Islamic God, or making claims about the kind of God that might be. So there's more work to be done. And same with the designer. In fact, when you start looking at the world around you, you start finding problems with the world. And you get onto issues with the design argument, because you have to start explaining poor design. You have to start explaining the problem of evil, so on and so forth. So David Hume, the famous Scottish philosopher, talked about how imperfect design, or imperfections in the design, would imply that the designer is imperfect, and that's a real problem if you believe that God is perfect, so on and so forth. So it's difficult to know where to start. I guess, like, maybe the first place to start is this false analogy, because on the one hand, the design argument is saying that a man-made product is designed by man. And then it's saying a nature-made product is designed by, instead of saying nature, it's saying a nature maker. Do you know what I mean? So, like, if it was truly analogous, you'd say a man-made product is designed by man. So, therefore man exists because we've got this man-made product, a watch. So a nature-made product, like a stone, implies that nature exists, right? It's another jump to go to God. I mean, we can explain the world naturalistically, right? And so therefore, it's not as solid an argument as one might think, especially when we start looking at all these other issues that there are.
Plus, I guess we can mistake a lot of things in nature as if they were made for us, because we're that big-headed that we think everything is made for us. I'm going to have to refer you to the cartoonish Ray Comfort a little video about almost showing people the benefits of oral sex. Showing a banana and how it is curved exactly to fit in our palm of the hands, and not knowing that bananas were never like that. These are artificially selected.
Yeah, and we had spent time, cross breeding and whatnot, and artificial evolution, artificial selection, actually, artificially selecting bananas to such a point that they ended up being like that. So yeah, that was a big problem. And of course, we've got to understand that nature isn't blind. Although we have a problem that we often put agency on evolution and nature, and we do that when we talk, and it's very difficult to get away from that. Even like people like Dawkins might accidentally slip into talking in evolution in terms of like it's designed to do this, or that you smuggle in this sense of agency, but it isn't. It's blind. However, it works with the bricks it already has available. It is constrained in the sense that it's survival of the fittest. So you've got these kind of guiding principles to evolution that there isn't like a guider, but they're just, in order to exist, this must be the case. And so therefore, evolution isn't just this blind random chance thing. There is random chance in it, but then the whole process is guiding towards benefits to the organism or species, so on and so forth. So it's about understanding what nature is. You need to be accurate with that.
And we're only here so we can talk about it, but we know that the average lifespan of a species around 2 million years, and over 99% of everything that lived on Earth is already extinct. So we're just lucky that we're here talking about it. But if we're not here to talk about it, it wouldn't even exist.
Well, this is where you need to talk about abductive arguments. I know I always speak about this with you, but abductive arguments are inferences to the best explanation, right? So we've got two competing hypotheses: omni-God, an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God, designing, creating the universe, or you've got not God, or you've got naturalism, atheism, whatever. So then you look at things like the universe, and you say that, okay, 90% of all species have already become extinct. Like, what does that better support? Like, what's going on there? Does that better support an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God, or kind of, atheistic scientific naturalism? When you look at pain and suffering in the world, when you look at things like why there is carnivorousness in the world, and I know this is one of my arguments in 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, but actually the important subtitle to my book is 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design, right? So a lot of this is about divine design, exactly what we're talking about. So when you look at carnivorousness in the world, you need to explain that in terms of, does it better support the hypothesis that omni-God exists, or that atheistic naturalism is the explanation for the universe? So does this look like imperfect design? Well, we can imagine that God could design species without either needing energy all the time, or by getting energy from the sun in kind of renewable ways that don't require the death and suffering of other beings and animals and entities. And so we look at it and say, well, does carnivorousness better support omni-God or atheistic naturalism? And again, that's a defeater, I would say, for the design argument, or at least it's a component of the case against the design argument.
Yeah, obviously that was going to lead you to the problem of evil, and you have the different justification for it, all the way from free will to building of characters. But that's obviously we've covered that, I think, in a different conversation. But today we're going to focus. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, sorry, I said the problem of evil is super important here, because this is, so if you're designing a universe and that universe contains a load of evil, and you are powerful enough to be able to make it different, you're knowledgeable enough to be able to know what to do about it, and you're loving enough to want to care, or to just want to do something about it, then why does all that evil exist? So actually the design argument and the problem of evil argument are, they go together.
Eventually, when you introduce an all-loving God, but
yes,
some might say, like if they are deists, and they might go, you know what, maybe there's a creator who's a bit nasty.
Well, if you're the true like deist, like philosopher's god, that you know nothing about that god, I would suggest that there's really not much functional difference between that and an atheist.
Yeah,
So, for example, like for me, did an entity like flick the first domino in the creation of the universe? Or maybe. I mean, can I know that? No. Does it make any difference to my entire worldview? No. And so, therefore, I often think of that kind of deism as functionally atheism. But you may
yeah.
disagree.
I've always said it's almost like that biological father who watches over his kid but doesn't want to have a relationship with him and is completely sort of fenced himself off that this kid will never be able to find the real father. Is it worth the time of that kid when he grows up to try to find his biological father? I argue not.
Well, yeah, you could well be right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there are lots of arguments. We've already touched on a bunch. Lots of arguments against this kind of teleological argument. In fact, you get dysteleological arguments. So dysteleological arguments are arguments from bad design. So, and again, Hume would say you are in a better position to suggest that in fact an imperfect designer exists than a perfect design. So if you want to go down the teleological argument route, you're more justified in believing an imperfect designer exists rather than a perfect designer.
So, devil's advocate, if some guy comes to you like a theist and say, why would God, why must he have a perfect design? Maybe his imperfections is meant to motivate humanity to come up with loopholes and ways around the difficulties. It's part of the test anyway. Who said life is going to be easy?
But yeah, and then you have to argue that still, if God is omnibenevolent, this has to be the optimal way of doing it. There can't be any gratuitous evil. So this has to be like the perfect amount of suffering designed into this system in order to achieve whatever end it is that you're talking about. There can be no unit of suffering less that is possible to achieve the same ends. Otherwise, that would be the state of affairs. So when you stub your toe this morning, that was absolutely necessary. That you couldn't have not stubbed your toe in order for whatever goal it is that you're talking about to be achieved. And of course, that that's maybe possible, but is it plausible? Is it probable? I would argue not. Like Emerson Green talks about, my friend Emerson Green, who's got a great YouTube channel and a blog, and he does a lot of counter apologetics. He wrote about the design argument this. Further support for this comes with the fact that nature is full of imperfection. Birth defects, forest fires, mental illnesses, and all the suffering endogenous to the system, that means within the system. That suffering that's built into the ordinary workings of nature, especially regarding suffering that is not a perversion of nature, but rather is part of how things ordinarily work. So carnivorousness is a good example. We might wonder if the designer is malevolent, but limited skill, knowledge, or power would explain things at least as well. Taking the imperfections of nature to be a reflection of the shortcomings of the designer is a much safer inference than an omnibenevolent designer, infinite in power and knowledge, plus some ad hoc hypothesis explaining why he couldn't do any better than relentless predation and cancer in children. A limited, imperfect designer, once again, is a more natural inference if we're adopting the principle of similar causes begetting similar effects, and further supposing that watches and lions have more in common than not. In other words, that he takes Paley's watchmaker and he says, you're saying here's a similar cause, similar effect, and he's like, if you're seeing that as an analogy, then it appears that whatever's designed this universe, if you are going to conclude it is a god, it's just a bit of a shoddy god, or an imperfect god, or is not doing a very good job, because you have to jump through a lot more hoops to get to, like you were saying, it could be that this is the perfect way of achieving some greater, and you have to start adding on these bolt-ons to the argument to get you from an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing god to designing what we see around us.
So when you hear the incredibly silly examples of design, and you hear that weird example of the Boeing 747 and a tornado inside a garage, I mean, what do you think goes inside the head here? Like they're expecting, they think nature is a tornado, and pieces of life come together by accident and bring to life conscious beings and intelligent stuff.
It goes back to that, just not really understanding how evolution works, how it builds on previous. It's not some random tornado that goes through a scrapyard. It's like, and has, so, we've got to understand that we could design like life forms better than evolution, right? If you start from
Mm.
scratch. So this teleological arguments do this. So for example, in my book, page 22, I talk about this. So women have narrow birth canals leading to painful deaths, almost, and maternal deaths. Remaining with pregnancy, ectopic pregnancies, where a fertilized egg can implant into the fallopian tube, cervix, or ovary rather than the uterus, can cause huge problems. Digestive or alimentary canals share the same pathway as our breathing system. It would be better, like with other mammals, like whales, if these were separate. Choking to death appears to be a design criterion for God. Thanks for that. Hernias, which cause the internal intestinal blockage, gangrene, and death, result from weaknesses in the abdominal wall caused by the development of male testes, and all sorts. So it goes on and on. I give a whole long list of examples of bad design. So if we started from scratch, we would do a better job of designing. But evolution can't do that. It can only work with what's already in the system for that species, or so that species. We're not going to evolve wings, right, in the next couple of generations, because we don't have the building bricks for that in our DNA as we are at the moment. So you've got to understand, it's not this tornado that throws things together randomly, and it's not this perfect designer that sits and designs something that is just really optimal. It's actually a suboptimal design system that gets away with, and I say design, again, smuggling agency, but I don't mean to. It's this suboptimal design system that gets you to survival with, with working with what it's already got, and possibly in suboptimal ways.
Why do most examples of intelligent design have inanimate, artificially made designs by humans, a watch, a Boeing 747, and conflate them with biological organism that has a DNA with inheritance in the code, a pressure for life? These are living organisms. That means they have to reproduce, they have to eat for energy, and therefore, and they have predation, pressure on the environment, and therefore they have to keep changing. And then they compare them to something that is inanimate, like a machine.
I think that's a really good point. But then again, you could look at things like a watch and look at it in terms of evolution. So a watch never just, it's not like Neolithic man suddenly got up and designed a watch. And it came, like, actually before that there was a less capable watch, and before that a less capable timepiece, and then you had to develop cogs, which probably came from wheels, and then so actually there's an evolution there, and you're just cherry picking some kind of part in that, and then saying and creating an argument
Yeah.
for that.
But
Actually,
it's
we
not
could.
really the evolution of the watch, it's the evolution of the thought give rise to watch, because watches on their own, left to their own devices, they will never evolve because they
No.
don't have the pressure.
But the thing about design as well, and these are genuine arguments against the kind of Aquinas teleological arguments, is that when you talk about a watch, quite often, it's a committee of people who design things. Like when you're talking about the analogy of human-made things, it's quite often like lots of us together, getting together and designing stuff, and designing it over time and having that evolution and so on and so forth. But when you're talking about God, suddenly it's just God on his own and stuff like that. And so actually there's arguably a bit of a disanalogy there, with how we go about designing things. So, that's something to consider as well.
Right, right. And now, designs, you mentioned flows. Obviously, humans are not perfect, and therefore we can come up with flow designs, and we could recognize that and do better next time. But we can do that from scratch. However, it seems that there is a very strange pattern in the evolution of organic stuff. It seems that there is no other way than inheriting the blueprint of what's flowed, or what could have suited a certain organism at some point and no longer make sense, like the nerve between the heart and the I think the nervous system, that is, it makes sense in shorter necks like fish and marine animals, but in a giraffe is completely absurd.
I mean, and this is where, if you really believe in a design argument being forceful, then you actually have to believe in theistic evolution. Because let's assume that evolution is a fact, right? It's a scientific theory, but you've got to understand the use of the term scientific theory here. It's not like, oh, just some hypothesis that I've come up with. This is like substantiated by an awful lot of science across a whole awful lot of disciplines. So evolution is a thing. Get over it. But the problem for theists is that you can't just take the design argument in isolation. You have to say, well, God is using evolution as the way of designing biological life. And therefore, and then if you're saying, well, if we're going back to the omni-God version of God, then it has to be the most loving way of designing biological life. And that's arguably not the case. And we can talk about the Darwinian problem of evil to show how that's really problematic.
This comment here, it's a funny one, and thank you, Option Select, for being member of the channel, supporting member, that is. This one analogy here was brought by Aaron Rao in a broadcast that we had a couple of weeks ago on Darwin's Day, and the thought that a male and female just coincidentally meet to reproduce, and both sort of have evolved separately, not knowing at all how sexual reproduction emerged, and how male female thing is an emergent property, and life didn't start that way. The complete ignorance of these facts lead to that creation myth of Adam and Eve and male and female, and obviously some bigotry about genders, and God created Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve, sort of baloney and things like that. It's quite funny.
Well, yeah, the whole, I mean, when you, again, so one of the principles of like philosophy of religion for me is that every observation you make needs to be explained by whatever worldview you're talking about. So we've got two competing hypotheses, and we've got omni-God theism and naturalistic atheism, and both of these are competing to explain everything. I mean, that is everything. So everything you see around you. Why is the sky blue? Why did I stub my toe? Why is there a war in Ukraine? Why was there a tsunami in 2004 that killed 240,000 people? Why? Sorry. Can I just?
Yeah. Go. Sounds like you've got an emergency. Yeah.
Yeah. Bear with me a second.
Yeah. Take your time. You can turn off your camera if you want to. Looks like Jonathan is going to have to attend to something really quickly. That's all right. He'll be with us in a few seconds. But it is quite interesting, this intelligent design, or the argument from design situation. It's always stems from lack of understanding of how evolution works, how science actually works in general, the difference between the evolution of animates, living organism, and the evolution of machines, which is designed by humans, and the evolution of them in terms of the evolution of thoughts that give rise to machines, and how we improve designs. But they can't evolve on their own. Only living organisms have that ability, because they are living, they are reproducing, they are passing on DNA and inherited traits, and they've got predation and other pressures that will compel them to change over time. If you put a watch in a drawer for 200 years, nothing will happen. The watch will still be the watch. It's never gonna, nothing's going to happen. But when you put rabbits in a forest, and there are predators who are really fast, over time you'll find these rabbits a lot more faster in the next generation, because the ones that could run fast enough would be eaten, and those who can survive will pass on their genes, and therefore you have a next generation of faster animals. I'm just checking my messages here. I think Jonathan is trying to tell me something. Okay, he's telling me there is a flood happening in his area. The area is flooding, so hopefully he'll be all right. Looks like it's coming back. When it rains in the UK, it rains in the UK. Cats and dogs usually. So yeah, so usually these arguments from design really stem from a very flawed understanding of sciences, biology, chemistry, or even the scientific method altogether. I can forgive William Paley for coming up with this analogy. He lived in a world before Darwin. William Paley died in 1805, and Darwin was only born in 1809. So it is there's no surprise that he did not understand how the evolution of the natural world works, because the understanding before Darwin came is the variety of human or biological organism cannot be just by fluke. They must have been designed. But Darwin showed later on that that's not the case, and everything we've seen so far, or then, have evolved from a common ancestor and not lesser, maybe less changed species that adapted to the timeline of their era. However, they're no longer supporting that particular environment, and therefore they have to evolve or die. That's usually how the game works. I can see Jonathan in the background is trying to obviously sweep some water. Looks like it's flooding in the area where he works, and he's doing his best to get up and running again. Um, he said just a couple of minutes, and I'm just going to respond to him. Take your time, and I'll try to fill the space, guys, until Jonathan comes. Right. So we're today's conversation is around intelligent design, the William Paley, the teleological argument. Teleological. When you hear that word, it's from a Latin word, means built or designed for a purpose. So a mug that has a handle that was teleologically made in with a design in mind. That handle will help you hold the mug, will protect your hand from the heat. So when you see a mug, you know it was made for a reason. And William Paley obviously used the watch analogy, and thought nature seems to be working in a way that suits human endeavors, and therefore they must have been designed. Not knowing so much information about how inhospitable life is to life, and it is not what it seems. Also, a lot of flaws in the evolution of multiple organisms, including humans, things like teeth, the blind spot in the eye, the appendix, the retina, which is back to front in the eye, causing the blind spot. So many different things. The back, the problem with the back, the human structure, which is more suited for being quadrupedal when we used to walk on all four. The toes in our feet, they serve no purpose, but they were very purposeful when we used to live on the trees. So all of that can be explained away through evolution. Looks like Jonathan is Jonathan, you ready? Give me the thumbs up if you're cool. Okay, so I can add you.
Oh my goodness! Right.
What happened there? Bit of flooding.
So God doesn't exist, because he wouldn't have designed a world where your son can leave the bath running and flood through your. I kept looking at my laptop and thinking, either I'm spitting loads. Why are there these little drips of water on my laptop? And I couldn't work it out while we were talking. And then it started coming through the lights. And so I've got some serious work to do after this.
Oh, with electrical stuff, yeah. Look, the good news is we're not going to be long because I've got an Arabic broadcast in about 40 minutes, debunking some scientific claims in the Quran. So that's going to be in Arabic. But we've got another 40 minutes, and hopefully that's not going to be long enough for you to be able to attend to your situation.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I'll have to cross that bridge when I come to it, or swim that river when I come to it.
Yeah.
What I was talking about, goodness me, Darwinian problem of evil. And I mentioned this before when we were going through my book in our video series, but this is to do with the design argument, really, and saying that if evolution is the system that God has used to design biological life, then there could be some problems here because it appears like it's a suboptimal system. So in the book I write, animal suffering as a result is seen by many thinkers as the strongest challenge to the defense of the problem of evil. Here is an example of such an argument that could be formulated, and I'll explain this afterwards. So 1, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good. 2, the evil of extensive animal suffering exists. So predation, carnivorousness exists. 3, necessarily God can actualize an evolutionary perfect world. So God has the ability to actualize an evolutionary perfect world. Necessarily, God can actualize an evolutionary perfect world only if God does actualize an evolutionary perfect world. 5, necessarily God actualized an evolutionary perfect world. So let's explain that. 5 follows from 3 and 4, but we have a contradiction since 5 and 2 cannot both be true. So it appears that 1 is false. The argument is to say that God could predict the mechanisms of evolution and design one in which animal suffering is minimized. This scenario can be called an evolutionarily perfect world. We could imagine a scenario where God could put in place an evolutionary system whereby, for example, just before a gazelle is given a killing bite by a lion, a gene is expressed that naturally tranquilizes the gazelle, or some such similar situation. But this appears not to be the case. Instead, we have extensive animal suffering that is hard baked into the evolutionary system and world. So what I was saying before is that with the design argument, you've got to take evolution as well. And you've got to say that if God designed, if you think that this is evidence that God designed the universe and that biological life is evidence that God designed the universe, then evolution as a system is the system that God has used. And if you believe God is all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, then this evolutionary system has to be the best system that you possibly could have envisaged and used in order to achieve whatever goal. But it seems rather problematic to say that evolution is the best system, or at least this is the best iteration of evolution, since we can imagine one where genes are expressed in a gazelle that means it doesn't feel pain as it's being ripped apart.
Mm-hmm. I left this comment on purpose. And Sky Works later on apologized for the typos, but I left it on purpose because I want to draw something very interesting here. I read this perfectly when I glanced at it. It's only when I returned back I found the mistakes, and that's called indexing in the human brain. The human brain at any given moment will take snapshots of things and will fill in the gaps, and that's why you can read a paragraph.
Without loads of vowels in there and stuff like that, and you can still make sense of it.
You can still make sense and read it, and that is testimony to evolution. If the brain going to stop at every little fart, you're not going to get anything done, and it's very efficient that way. That's how you sort of use less fuel and less energy, and that can only be understood in that abductive argument that Jonathan was making. If you have the two criteria that you're going to be using to which one is going to better explain the data, the atheistic, or at least forget about atheistic, the naturalistic hypothesis will fit the analogy here quite perfectly.
Absolutely. I'd agree. Something else I want to talk about is the idea of regularity. And you can actually you can branch off and have some really big discussions about regularity and order, because really that's what this is about. I think you can boil the argument from design down to why is there order and regularity. In my one of my previous books, Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist, one of the chapters is what I call the argument from formats. It's probably been thought up by other philosophers, but it was a paper an essay I penned years ago, which is, in order for anything to exist, you must have regularity. So if there wasn't regularity, you literally couldn't have existence. So this is one of my arguments for causal determinism at some stage, at some level in reality, because if things can decohere, so say, I don't know, I'm being a bit simplistic here, but say 0.1% of things just like stopped working regularly and therefore stopped doing their function, like some particle just stopped being, then you wouldn't be able to have like a biological system that is dependent on that. You like your consciousness would not be able to work. Your biological systems wouldn't be able to work because there'd just be decoherence happening. Everything has to work regularly in order for existence to be meaningful, in order for it to be predictable, in order for it to allow for building blocks to work in the way that evolution does. Your stuff has to work in a predictable and regular manner, and that is just a necessary component of existence. So when the design argument looks at regularity and says, well, this is therefore God exists because nothing can explain regularity. Well, actually, I think he's looking at it the wrong way. It's like you literally can't get existence without regularity. So if there is going to be existence, there will be regularity. And you might have lots of different universes that have popped up, but the only ones that are going to beget us thinking about the universe in the way that we do and having these conversations is a universe that has strict regularity. And then you can get onto like Humean natural law arguments about, like David Hume talks about natural laws, and he was talking about, are natural laws prescriptive or descriptive? So think of a dictionary. When you read a dictionary, you might think, like when you're a kid, you think that's how things are supposed to be spelt. That's what it means. That it's telling me the laws. But actually, dictionaries are the other way around. They describe how we use language. It doesn't tell you how you should spell something. It just says, generally, when we spell this, it's spelt like this. But go to America and they spell it differently. So there's no like law that's prescribing down on how we use language. So a dictionary just describes how language is used and then puts it in a book. So natural law. Sorry,
I was going to say, the verb dive, to dive, and the past of that in British English is dived, and the American kept saying dove for quite some time. It has actually made it into the dictionary, and sneak and snuck eventually became a word because it's so widely used. And so, people understand it. People communicate. Well, that's the function of language at the very end of the day. If you can't communicate it, well, let's make it official. Let's make it a word.
A great example is literally, and this one gets me. I always listen to the radio and someone says, he was literally on fire on the football pitch. Like, he wasn't. Like, he wasn't actually on fire. So now literally in some dictionaries is known as a contronym. So a contronym is a word that means the opposite of what it's supposed to mean. So there are some dictionaries that say literally now means metaphorically. So it now means the opposite. It's just like a way that we exaggerate. So it's literally the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Yeah, but was it? So, but anyway, so that's quite right. And that's a good thing to chip in with there. So that's how language is functional. That's how it gets used. So when it comes to natural laws, there is this argument in philosophy: are they prescriptive? Do you have these laws that exist out there, and that is how the universe must act? And that, I think, would favor maybe a god. But then actually, I think it's more like how dictionaries really operate, which is matter and stuff, energy and whatever, acts in a regular way, and we derive from that natural laws, and we say, well, this is how it always works, so this is going to be a law that we write to describe how reality works. But it's not prescriptive, it is descriptive. And I think that you can tie this in with like design arguments. I think design arguments are all about this kind of top-down approach of like God has made a bunch of laws and everything must adhere to them. Whereas I would say that these are necessary for mere existence, this kind of regularity, and out of that we can describe how things work. And
Yeah,
and there's
yeah.
still the question: why do things work in that particular way? And maybe
Yeah.
these are questions that will never be
It's almost like
answered.
the arguments is back to front. Critical thinking. Thank you so much. He's a supporting member of my channel, and he seems to be in love with your ideas, Jonathan.
His eyes aren't painted on. I mean, yeah, I agree with him. They're great. No, thank you. I really appreciate that.
So, Jonathan, I mean, you made a very good point, because now we're going to move a little bit from the biological realm, evolution and the living organism, and we talked about a bit of cosmology and physics, because another argument has been made in the sort of within the camp of intelligent design and teleology, and argument from design is fine tuning, the fine tuning argument. And the fine tuning arguments talk about a certain constants. If they change by a hair, life wouldn't emerge. But because they're seeing it the other way around, you're saying that the initial conditions is geared towards equilibrium. And that's everything in physics. And by the way, this is established in physics, that equilibrium makes existence. If they decohere, there isn't existence to talk about. And there could have been attempts like that yielded nothing, and therefore they're not talked about. But the one, or maybe the many, we don't know, that result into the stuff we are in right now, we look back and trying to make sense of things, and we make the mistake of going, oh my God, looks like the hole in the ground, like if we are the water, it's made exactly for us. Not realizing that we are the water will always take the shape of whatever hole we land in.
Yeah. Good. Where to start? So, with regard to fine-tuning arguments, initially, I'd say, sort of a bit facetiously, it appears that the universe is actually fine-tuned for death rather than life. When you've got, it's easier to die than it is to live and survive. When you've got black holes littered around the universe, when it's really very difficult for life to begin. So, estimates of life in the universe vary, but if there is life out there, and I think there is, it's going to be very distant from us. In other words, again, this goes back to a sort of design argument here, which is like, if God designed the universe for life, you would imagine there would be so much life kicking around that it would be perfect for life. Like, if you sat down and you said, right, you're going to design something, it needs to be able to do this, right? I think I had this analogy with you previously, but if I said, Hanny, come into my house, I've designed this rabbit hutch for these. I love rabbits. You know how much I love rabbits. I've designed this rabbit hutch. They come out here and out into my back garden, and I show you my back garden. My back garden is actually like 1,000 miles long. I've got 3 rabbits, right? And it turns out that I've got this rabbit hutch that is actually goes up to the moon. Right? It's just vast, but over there, in that corner of the hutch is like this pool of lava where if they get too close to, they'll die. And then over there, and I tell you this, you're expecting, before you go out and look outside, you're thinking, he loves rabbits, this place is going to be just perfect for rabbits, there's going to be rabbits everywhere, it's going to be like the super best rabbit environment. And then you walk out and you go, there's 3 rabbits, this massive thing that they're not going to even see up to the moon, the rabbit's never even going to get up there, so what's the point of having all that? And you look at it and think, this isn't designed for rabbits, right? This is just shite. So therefore, when you look at the universe, you're like, it looks like it's designed, but is it designed for life? Well, actually, most of the universe is devoid of life. And in the places where life exists, it's really easy to die. So it looks actually far more likely that it's designed for death than life. Do you know what I mean? So there are these issues which you can bring into play with a fine-tuning argument as well.
Yeah, and once you add everything is distant to annihilation, for sure. That's what everything has a certain, everything runs on energy. Energy runs out, you're dead.
This is something I wanted to talk about today, actually. Thank you for
Literally.
reminding me. My papers are now covered in water, so it's quite difficult to read. But this is exactly right. So when you look again, it's inference to the best explanation. Omnigod, theism, naturalistic atheism. And you think, right, if this universe looks like it's designed, if you think this is the watch, then you have to look at what's the intention here, because as you say, energy is going to run out. We're going to a certain heat death. Everyone's going to die. Everything is going to die. I mean, that's about as certain as we can get in this universe, is that it ain't going nowhere as far as like eternal life is concerned. And what does that better support? Does that better support an all-loving God, or does it better support naturalistic atheism? Won't give a toss whether life lasts 1 billion years, 5 billion years, or whatever, and there's a heat death of the universe that's awaiting us. So I think when you look at all these components of the universe, all these characteristics of the universe, each time for me they just better support naturalistic atheism. I think it's really difficult to look at the design features of the universe and argue that these are the hallmarks of an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God.
So let's get away from the God of Spinoza, that sort of
Okay.
colorless God that doesn't have any features. Let's go to the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible has described his method. Like we talked about the creation of Adam and Eve. Adam from clay or mud or dust. Depends on whichever holy text you subscribe to, and then eventually Eve from his rib. And when you compare them, so we've got information now on Homo sapiens and how we emerge and evolve from common ancestors and things like that. How can a Christian now justify his or her beliefs? Do they have to be then literally? And when I mean literally here, I mean the opposite of literally.
So what's the question? So what?
So
where?
how? I mean, do they then take it as an allegory? That's the only way out, or do they say, sorry, evolution is hoax, and the whole Western world is a cover up?
I think it's just really difficult to take. It's really difficult to take the Bible and conclude and to have that cohere with all the data that we see around us, and still, like, literally the Bible is not literally true, because it can't be, because data suggests, like, historical data, biological data, like, it is hugely problematic. But I think it's morally problematic, morally problematic, historically problematic, theologically problematic, and I don't think there's any way around that. And so what people do is they try and make it fit the data by smashing it around. Some people try and make the data fit to the Bible, but they are people like young earth creationists, and I think that they bastardize rationality so much that they're not worth taking seriously. But other people who are more worth taking seriously have to just adapt the Bible and their theology to the data of the universe. And I just think that it just becomes really ad hoc, really sort of ad hoc or post hoc. The idea of Satan, like who is Satan in the Bible? Do you take that literally? Well, then you've got huge problems with the philosophy of Satan, for a start, and I argue about that in my book, which is that if God really is all powerful, then God could snuff out Satan like that. So if Satan exists and is doing stuff, he's doing it on behest of God. God's omissive will or active will wants Satan to be doing stuff, because otherwise, if God didn't want Satan to be doing stuff, Satan wouldn't be doing stuff. So therefore, but it's trying to make all this stuff fit, like the data of the universe and also philosophy and logic. And I think you're on a hiding to nothing with the Bible. It's an interesting book, cultural book, but I don't think any of it stands up to any kind of rigorous evaluation.
It looks like evolution and natural selection is almost like it's a black hole. That a black hole, even light cannot escape its gravity. Evolution is so strong that even Satan and God himself could not escape them. They have their own evolution story.
Well, as with everything, you can see, and in fact, that's quite an interesting way of looking at things, because I've often thought, when you can see the development of heaven and hell, and in the intertestamental period, I know we're going off topic here, but when you understand how those ideas came to be a part of Christian thought, it kind of actually takes away from the probability that it's true. When you see how, I know you could argue this is a genetic fallacy if we know how it came to be, blah blah blah. But actually understanding how that came to be, you understand that heaven and hell were like had a functional use that was useful for the Jews at the time of the Seleucid Empire, who were being oppressed by these other Jews, and they're like, why is bad stuff happening to good people? We're good people. And it's like, oh, and then they looked at the Jews who are oppressing them, and they're like, oh, they've got ideas of the Hellenic, like the Greek world, and there's Tartarus and the Elysian Fields, and actually, oh, I can understand how good stuff can happen to bad people now if there's an afterlife. And then you see this development, and it's like a needs must. And then you think, well, does that, like, if it was really that important, why wasn't it from the Bible right from the beginning, and so on and so forth? And we get to this the simple conclusion that heaven and hell almost certainly don't exist, because we can see how it developed in this very like human functional way.
There's a question for you here. I'm struggling to understand the grammar of it, but I think I might have an intuition. Can you ask Jonathan MS Pearce for a salutation of postmodernism about using devices and using search button and computers, but more to nature and warm depth for the day? I think, is he asking the effect on us using artificially made devices and neglecting to smell the roses and enjoy nature? That's what I'm getting.
I don't know. I'm not sure. It needs to be sort of rephrased
Hopefully,
in a
you
way.
can rephrase it, please, Mojo. Yeah.
Yeah. But going back to the design element, there was something else I was going to say, which is also with design. When we see design before, this philosopher Sam Runkoff talked about this with like YouTube trick shots, which is really interesting. So when you look at a YouTube trick shot, so a video where you get these people, I don't know, bouncing a ball and it does this and it bounces and hits that or whatever, dude perfect videos or whatever, and you see it and you think that's amazing. That looks like these guys are geniuses, right? They are just that is truly brilliant. What you don't see is 1,000 times they've screwed that up and got it wrong. So you can actually apply this to design arguments as well. So you can say, look at how wonderful this design, this thing is. Isn't God perfect? Even though that I'd argue this is an imperfect design. But actually, you don't know that God's not screwed up 1,000 times in making other universes which are like proper bad, or that we are in fact one of those screwed up universes, and there's a much better universe somewhere else. So
Yeah.
you need to be wary about.
There is even a better trick, Jonathan. Instead of filming something for 1,000 times in order to come with a perfect shot, now they do video editing, so it will look like that. And nature can do that to you sometimes. You could see something in a certain way, but it is not really what you think it is.
Well, explain.
So, like, for example, everybody thought the Earth was flat, and I think they had a bloody good reason. I mean, you and I lived 1,000 years ago. We probably would have thought that. It's very intuitive. If we walk for 1,000 miles, it's a good song by a Scottish band. And you've got Peter Griffin as a backup singer, apparently, in the Family Guy. So he was a backup singer for the song. You'll think the Earth is flat. And so it's quite intuitively. And then once you actually get to know and science advances, you'll think what you thought before was nothing but an illusion for you. And therefore, life can, things like can be tried 1,000 times in terms of the creation of different universes. But sometimes it's things that we don't understand the way they actually are. We think of them in a certain way, but the reality is they aren't that way.
Well, I think there's an interesting segue here back into the design argument very explicitly, which is agenticity and patternicity. And people like Michael Shermer have talked about this in their books, and a lot of people use this as to why we think God exists, because we look at stuff and we see agency in everything, and we see patterns in things. In fact, there's quite a good argument against the design argument from this kind of patternicity. I might share that with you if I can find it, but I think Yeah. So when we an example is of how this is kind of inherent in humanity is that children will look at a rock out there, and there's been experiments on this, data collected. So children will look at a rock out in the backyard or whatever, and they'll see an animal scratching its back on the rock, and they will say that rock is there so that the animal can scratch its back on it, and they will put, so it is really inherent in us that we connect like the dots, but quite often incorrectly, and we see that that is there for a reason. So when you talk about purpose and goal, so teleological argument is about the universe having a purpose, a goal. So Aquinas talked about an arrow flying through the air towards a target. We just think that there's a reason this exists, that like that rock exists so that the animal can scratch its back. This universe exists so that, rather than, and I think that that's a bias that we are bringing to this, rather than, do you know what, it's just a brute fact and shit happens, and this is it. So it's kind of smuggling in the teleological argument is smuggling in the idea that there is a purpose, that there is a goal. In fact, Thomas Aquinas, if I can just say, like, this is really where we should have started, but we started with Paley's watchmaker. Thomas Aquinas says the fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack knowledge, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result, kind of regularity. Hence it is plain that they achieve their end, not fortuitously, but designedly. Now, whatever lacks knowledge cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. As the arrow is directed by the archer, therefore some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Which I think is just problematic. It's just full of loads of assertions about things actually having some ultimate purpose. And this is the argument that many theists have, is like, well, you've just got a meaningless existence, you atheists. It's like, no, we create our own meaning, but it's not ultimate. I'd agree we don't have ultimate meaning or ultimate purpose, because I don't think there is an ultimate being to have that. But even if you're, as a theist, believes in ultimate meaning or purpose, that's not your meaning. That's the meaning and purpose of this thing, impressing it upon you. This God up there impressing their meaning and purpose on you. And I think that is almost like oppressive. It's like, I think it's much more liberating to work out, to divine, if you like, my own meaning in life and my own purpose, to carve out my own destiny, if you like.
Completely agree. Do you think?
Not often.
Therefore, you are. Um,
Or am I?
do you think that we've evolved to survive, not to know the truth? And therefore, biases, which most logical fallacies stem from, and flawed thinking, are not that important, because our biases uh, that we think now that quite flawed have been the culprit of our survival. A lot of biases, without them, we would have not been here.
This is kind of the evolutionary argument against naturalism by planting it, and the idea that we don't evolution doesn't favor truth, and deterministic, causality doesn't favor rationality, and all these kind of argument from reason, evolutionary argument against naturalism, and there are lots of arguments against that. We probably don't have time. I mean, one thing is that yes, evolution favors survival, and that doesn't always mean truth. However, if you get truth badly wrong, things can go wrong. So, for example, if I'm a frog and I'm trying to eat a fly in order to survive, and I believe the fly is at point A, and I stick my tongue out, and it hits point A, and I get the fly, then like my belief in reality, it favors kind of truth. Whereas if I think it's at point B, but it's actually at point A, and I stick my tongue out at point B, then I'm not going to get the fly. In other words, you can argue that we do favor truth, and things become rather problematic when we kind of move away from truth too much. And so, but these are sort of huge arguments, and they're a lot more complicated than that. But I think, again, once we've got to a point where we've got this rationality that we can use, and we've got the knowledge that we have, we can, I don't know whether you can say we can bypass some of those evolutionary pressures, or at least bypass some of those evolutionary hangovers. So some of those biases, we can try and overcome them, and we realize that they aren't helpful for accessing truth. So are we at a point where we're bypassing evolution, or is this itself part of evolution? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So sometimes we think we've outgrown evolution, but that in itself is like allowing anything that allows us to survive and to flourish is itself, part of the evolutionary mechanism.
I quite like what you said, that knowledge matching reality and truth must have been a prerequisite for survival. You cannot not have it, and that's why one of the highest source of epistemology is know-how. Like riding a bicycle, you might not need to write the reason and how, but you can ride a bicycle, you can prove it, you can do it, and that's probably what the ancient people did. That's the kind of epistemology they've relied on, the know-how. But only when it comes to inferences and things that are out of reach and things that they wonder what's that light up in the sky, what it does. I mean, things like that. This is where the mind starts to race, and you come up with different scenarios. But you're right. I think inevitably survival must include elements of truth, even in the epistemological field of know-how.
Well, this is interesting because you get onto like different theories of epistemology. So, which is a study of knowledge and truth. So, what is knowledge? What is truth? And some people say, the correspondence theory of knowledge is that I believe this about the world, and if that corresponds with how the world is, then that is true, right? And I've got knowledge of the world. But the problem is, you can't know that. There's an epistemic barrier in between that. So I can't prove that I'm not a brain in a vat or whatever. So it's like, yeah, that's a great theory of truth, but you can't actually prove it. And so then you start thinking about, okay, so maybe there are pragmatic theories of knowledge, which is like things that are useful. So if I believe this and it's useful, and again, this is where the evolutionary argument, naturalism might say, well, actually it doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but it depends what you define as by being true and what you define as being knowledge. So you can say, well, if I think this is true because actually it's pragmatically useful and I use it every day and it allows me to survive, then it is as good as being true, type thing. So there are these different theories of knowledge and truth, and perhaps you have to unpick all of these things to kind of properly understand whether evolution.
So do you think that epistemology then is it would better confine it to the usability, to the human survival and comfort, and maybe the search for ontology is a little bit of a chasing shadows?
So the book before this book was Why I'm Atheist and Not Atheist, and it was the full title was it Knowledge, Meaning, and Morality in a Godless World. And the front cover picture is a wall, and it's kind of building up to, and the idea is you eventually get to like atheism, but before that you get morality, and before that you get teleology, and before that you get epistemology, and before that you get ontology. So you've got to build these things up, and they all impact each other. So how you do epistemology might depend on how you think the universe is set up, but then how you think the universe is set up is itself like a result of an epistemological process. And so these things are all intertwined, and one will affect the other. But I think, there'll be elements of pragmatism to our knowledge. There'll be, in a perfect world, correspondence theory of truth is right, but then how do I know that? So then you start talking about things like probability, Bayesian analyses of stuff, and saying, well, if I had two competing hypotheses like before, what's most likely to be true? And let's talk about my background knowledge. Let's talk about prior probability, let's talk about posterior probability and all that. And then so you use all these things, but I don't know that there's one epistemology that I would say that's what I am. I think it's just a mixture of everything that allows me to successfully navigate life. So it's really a bit of a
two hits we've taken over the last few hundred years. We're not the center of the universe as we once thought. We're not in the center of anything. There's no such thing as the center of the universe.
Speak for yourself, mate.
It depends, and then the second hit is like, we are not designed this, and humanity is no different than all animals. As a matter of fact, we are classified animals in biology. We are actually apes. We are human apes. And these two facts hit people so hard. Some people would just refuse to believe in them. They think they're quite demeaning. Do you find them demeaning?
Well, I've just finished a book with Dr. Aaron Adair called "Religion and Aliens: Where Two Worlds Collide," and what we seek to do in that book is look at the probability of intelligent life existing out there in the universe, and conclude that it definitely exists out there in the universe somewhere. It's just very long way away, blah blah blah. And then you start using these arguments such as the Copernican principle that says that if there is lots of life out there, then we're probably likely in the middle of the bell curve. Just looking at averages, we're going to be an average life form, which means that there's going to be life forms out there that are vastly more intelligent than us, and life forms that are less intelligent than us, and we're going to be somewhere in the middle. So we have this idea that we're the chosen ones, we're like designed by God, blah blah blah. But actually, when you start thinking about the size of the universe and all these other ideas, in all probability, there are vastly more intelligent life forms that are vastly more moral, may have greater moral knowledge, and may have access to stuff that we can't even fathom. And how does that fit in with theists who believe that in the that adhere to the teleological argument? How does that fit in with people who adhere to the truth of the Bible? Where are we the chosen ones? Are we the apex of design and the apex of creation? It's more likely actually that there are other far greater beings out there than us.
So if the universe is about 13.78 billion years, our Earth is only 4.5, and life emerged about 3.7. Homo sapien appeared about 300,000 years. If there was a planet, and now the James Webb Telescope can find galaxies that formed after 600 million years only from the start of the universe, so 13.1 billion years, you could have had planets. And if there is a planet that is about 11 billion years, and life began, same sort of averages, about maybe 10 billion years. So, and then intelligent species like us have emerged about 5 billion years ago. So they are 5 billion years older than us. How vast can the knowledge gap be?
Indeed. And then you start wondering about, if they exist, then that gives us hope that we aren't going to destroy ourselves. But we talk about loads of these ideas in the book, by the way. So when that book comes out in a couple of months, that'll be one. Well, I'll come back and speak to you about it.
You and Aaron to appear on the channel and talk about the book, please. I'm very, very curious.
Yeah, there are loads of ideas like that, and he's the knowledge on the idea. He's the sci-fi guy. He's a scientist involved in this kind of stuff. He's worked on SETI before, but just loads of. It's just really interesting that if you're genuinely like a committed Christian or Muslim, it's again like understanding that everything in the universe needs to be explained in light of your worldview. So if there is really good indication that life exists out there, how does that work with your ideas of design? How does that work with your theology? And Skyworks here talks about psychology there. That's another really good, when you talk about design and you talk about dysteleology, and again, going back to this idea that everything needs to be explained by your worldview. What hypothesis, naturalistic atheism versus omnigod theism, what hypothesis better explains psychological conditions? We can talk about cancer, and we can talk about earthquakes, we can talk about all these design problems, but one that's often forgotten is a psychological ailment or psychological conditions. Schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism. That's part of our design, right, in creation, okay? Demonstrably so. If you believe in God, well, how do you explain that? God seems to be an incompetent designer, or purposefully designing in things that give us pain and suffering, psychological pain and suffering.
This is very true, considering when we add a couple of things like these ailments, psychological ailments, inherited in the brain that you have not chosen, can lead to the misery of others. If you're a psychopath or somebody with damaged amygdala or frontal lobe cortex end up being a serial killer on the back of it, or taking your own life if you're bipolar, or causing the misery of others, or making moral decisions, what seems to be moral decisions in our realm, on the back of that will continue to heaven or hell on the back of something that you have not even chosen, and you cannot escape.
I mean, that's exactly the sort of stuff I talk about in this book. So, everyone check out the previous series that we've done on that. Exactly those. Like, it appears to me that God is unfair, given all the supposed omni-God characteristics. That you can be born with these conditions, and it appears that you've been designed with those conditions, or at least God has neglected to not design them all. That's a triple negative there. I've confused myself. Thank you, Ricky. That's really kind.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you very much. I'm glad that the conversation is inspired and triggers some thoughts, and that's exactly what Jonathan and I are trying to do, is trying to get people to think and ponder over things like that. Very important.
One final point possibly to make, because I think I've exhausted my teleological criticisms, is the fallacy of composition, or fallacy of division, depending on which way you look at it. So this is the idea that you look at things in the universe and you think that that's got purpose. So you might look at the Paley's watchmaker, you might look at that and say that's got the hallmarks of design, but then we're inside that, and then you look at the universe as a whole and you say therefore the universe is designed, or the universe has purpose. And of course that might not be the case. So it could be that watch has purpose because humans have purpose. We don't necessarily have purpose. We've given a purpose to that watch, but if a cat came along or an alien came along and saw that watch, they wouldn't know what it's got no purpose or meaning to them. Is that purpose inherent in the watch? No, that purpose is only means anything to humans. So therefore that is a human to watch relationship. But without humans, that wouldn't exist and wouldn't have that purpose. So that's within the universe. Think of the universe as a whole and say, well, therefore the universe has purpose, or the universe has a goal because that watch has a goal, or humans have a goal, is a problem. It might be that the universe does, and it might be that God exists, and all of this is explained by God, but it doesn't necessarily follow, and it's problematic, I think, to make that jump. And likewise, you could say the universe may have a purpose. Doesn't mean everything in the universe has a purpose or meaning. So there are possibly these big sort of jumps that are unjustified that go on there.
And the fallacy of composition is quite interesting because it's not dismissed on its face value, because the same type of logic can be used in inductive logic to infer, to go from a special case to a general case, and it's possible as long as it is consistent with observation and falsification. So you can use the exact same logic to infer that if iron is metal and it shrinks, and when it's cold and it's when it's excited it extends, and therefore all metals will display the same sort of property, and that's inductive reasoning. It becomes a fallacy of composition is by inferring that fact without actually having to go on trying to make a case out of it and actually prove it outside of that.
It becomes kind of like probability assessment, and then eventually you're going to have to go and get some data to either support that or start again. But and that's really hard to do with things like teleological arguments. I mean, going back to what Aquinas said, as I say, I think it's just full of assertions that the idea that the arrow is directed by the archer, therefore some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their ends, and this being we call God. I just think it's just a massive jump that is unjustified for all the reasons we talked about. I would contest that the teleological argument has purchase.
Great. I'd like to thank you so much, Jonathan. I always enjoy the conversation with you. You always give me new things to think about and new ideas. Do you want to tell people, while you've got a few people's attention, what your next work, what you're going to be working or doing next?
Yep. So I really appreciate the time that you've allowed me here. I do apologize for my roof having an inundation of water coming from above. It turns out that Noah's flood might actually there might be some truth to that or something, because that was some inundation. No, I apologize if that screwed up your video, but I really thank you for that. I am still hanging out at Only Sky, where I do writing as a journalist for a non-religious media organization. I have my own YouTube channel, A Tippling Philosopher, and ATP Geopolitics, where I'm reporting on the Ukraine war, and I do lots of content for that. I have a book coming out, Aliens and Religion. I'm still halfway through writing a book with an archaeologist that's the final piece of my trilogy. So I wrote a book on the Nativity, a critical examination, Resurrection, a critical examination, the Easter story, and I'm writing the Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story, and that will sort of take all those three things and knock them down. Then you kind of what's left of Christianity, really. So that's kind of what I'm working on. But yeah, just busy.
I'd like to thank you very much. Guys, within about 20 minutes, I'll be live again, but this time in speaking in tongues. And there's a lot of throaty sounds coming with my Arabic language, debunking scientific miracles within the Quran. Thank you so much for your attention. And,
you are indefatigable, because what time is it in Australia, mate?
What's that? Say it again.
You're indefatigable. What time is it in Australia?
Oh, it's going to be 1:30 a.m. when I first. So because that's when the Middle East is up. They're late risers. They don't like mornings. So it's a brilliant world, but all for the sake of spreading the good news.
Absolutely, the good rational news of enlightenment.
Thanks very much. All right, guys. Well, you're going to see the outro now, and I think you're going to feature in the outro, Jonathan. So stick around so you get to see it.
Got to see this.